All right. Sociology of Religion, Lecture 3. We're on the week of Superstition and the Supernatural. And Supernatural is not about a show that is really fun to watch, about two guys in a really cool car trying to fight evil in the world from Lawrence, Kansas. It's about stuff that we think outside of ourselves, though, as far as what we believe about the divine or spirits or demons, and superstition plays into that as well. So we're going to look at those things today. I'm aging myself, but one of my favorite songs about superstition is Stevie Wonder. You can read it, you can sing it, very superstitious, and if it sticks in your mind throughout the whole lecture, that's fine. But these things that we think of as superstitious have some sort of a cultural history to them. 13, it was discussed in the text, because that can be Judas, the 13th disciple. That can be the day of a week that was happening for Passover. These are kinds of things that people put together, breaking a glass, getting 7 years bad luck. All that stuff is something we suffer from. Even if you don't believe them, sometimes they get stuck in your brain, make you feel a little uneasy when some of these things happen. So for example, when you take a moment to consider some superstitions you've heard of, don't step on a crack. Can you fill that in? Yeah, don't, it'll break your mother's back. Don't break a mirror or you'll have. When a black cat crosses your path, I don't know if that just gives you bad luck forever. I've always wondered about that one because we have like a myriad of black cats in our neighborhood, and Bitch and I should be just dead by now. But there are little things like that in families, though. You may have something in your history. My family doesn't buy blue cars, and my husband didn't believe me. And I said, we've always had bad luck with blue cars. Engines don't work or something goes on. And we bought a blue car for him used. And within 5 miles, it had caught fire in the engine. And he then jumped onto the Todds don't buy blue cars. So those are things we have experience with that may not be real. It's just something that we organize ourselves around. So what's the difference between religion and superstition? That's a really important thing. Table 3.1 in the text is important to read if you've got that. These are the basics of that in the next 2 slides. But religion, as we've talked, is an organized social construct, typically built by eventually nation states establishing themselves from civilization to create cohesive community and have an idea about the meaning of life. So that's the best way to look at religion. It's shared beliefs and value. The values that you learn in a religion are typically from that ancient source that constantly gets reevaluated as society develops. It has a shared way of life, usually morals and values, that creates that sense of the glue that people feel when they're connected together. Shared meaning gives a sense of peace and being able to operate and live in this world, a social identity, to label yourself as a religious person or a non-religious person gives you identity. Either way, one is not better than the other. One is just saying what you are identifying with. And then finally, life validation. Religion is either telling you, as you adhere to one, that I'm part of this group and this is what we believe in. I may not believe 100%, but I'm at a level that I can claim this as my own. Or being non-religious can be the same way. It's a group. There's a whole bunch of people that don't have a religious life, but they're spiritual, and they have a sense of being outside of a religion. So they're not necessarily always superstitious. They're not always caught into these ideas about the supernatural world, but they have identified themselves as non-religious. And so these are ways in which we kind of use that center of religion to say, you're either part of a system that's like this, organized in this way, or you're part of another system that isn't organized this way, but it's in context and connection too. Whereas superstition is this: it's idiosyncratic beliefs and values, meaningful only to the individual. Meaning each one of us, we may have been raised in a family that's highly superstitious, but each one of us is going to take that and interpret it very differently. My parents, one time, they couldn't sell a house. They took it's Joseph, I think it is, turned it upside down in the front yard. They sold the house. Did that cause that to happen? I don't know. But for them, in that individual moment, they were frustrated. It brought them some sort of peace of mind to make that act happen. And, this is that individual. It's not something that everybody tells you to do. It's not something that you'll find necessarily always in your religious doctrine, but it is kind of a cultural thing that you may pick up. It's a personal life choice to be superstitious. When you have this, you may, and this is so funny because in sports, there's so many superstitions and people know about this. I always go back to Major League and a guy that, put some stuff on his bat. It's just a little, set of beads, and it's kind of a mixture of a voodoo and a little Christian Catholicism. And eventually the rest of the team, when they're wanting to win, asks him to do that to their bat. Those, it may seem like that's making fun of it, but I know so many sports people, they have these routines, what they wear, the different kinds of clothes you wear for a game. That's superstition. That's not something that every single person's going to do. It's something that you believe. It has personal meaning, existential uncertainties going on. You're not sure something's going to happen, so you're trying to ensure something's going to happen. There's solitary identity, meaning I identify with this. I don't really need to explain the superstition to anybody because it's mine. And, that's part of life. And there's life negation. It legitimates hiding from the world. And what I mean by that is that its worst form, superstition, can creep its way into social structures and religion in a way that it creates this, the demons or the devils or the spirits made me do this horrible thing, or, they're demonizes people even, I don't have to reach out to certain people because I can hide from that because they're not on the winning side, kind of going back to that barbaric belief about world domination. And so these are things we have to watch with superstition. It can get out of control, but typically it's in this upper category of something that's individual. One thing, superstition continues to be something that's developed because of gnosis, where there are certain people that feel like they have higher knowledge, meaning we attribute that in religion to our priests. I'm a pastor in the United Methodist Church. A lot of times people would come and ask me to bless their homes with incense, or when we're experiencing birth or death or uncertainty. I am given a great privilege to have higher knowledge about that. And so as a sociologist, I know that that is an organized principle that keeps everybody aware of that uncertainty, and they need somebody that has been allotted by a community that certain knowledge. And so gnosis, if it's positive, is using reason to understand why this is important. I think, currently our current pope is often using reason to describe what's going on in the world as far as racism, sexism. He's not got the whole system figured out, but he speaks out with this kind of positive gnosis. We see this with the Dalai Lama. We see this with people that like Richard Rohr and others in the Protestant tradition, where it is using reason to kind of recognize this higher knowledge of why we need that certainty. Negative gnosis can happen though too, where people feel like they have a higher knowledge based on superstition. It's a situation where it's an individualized personal belief that you have a higher knowledge. It doesn't have any context of being checked. For example, I'm a pastor, but I'm constantly having to turn in things to district superintendents or make certain connections with fellow clergy or different parts of the organization that keep me in check so I don't, go start a cult or something. But a negative gnosis is often, a person on their own. They're charismatic. They often present. And this week in the movie that you'll be watching, not Baraka, but the one about cults, the end of the world religion cult. I'm not sure if that's this week or next week, but I think it's this week. You're going to see a lot of it. People who believe and give other people power, that charisma, and they're following what a sociologist would call as a superstition. So religion assures us that such higher purposes are in fact important for life. It's at different levels important that religion actually helps people to feel a sense of certainty, but also has checks and balances. Typically, we don't always see that happen. Obviously, we've seen cases of sexual misconduct, and I don't want to say that just to one religion. People have often said that something, in the Catholic Church, and honestly, it happens as much in the Protestant Church. It happens in Islam, happens in Buddhism. This is something that, the negatives of that happen all the time, but we have checks and balances that hopefully correct that. But then we also have a sense of, that being what I call positive gnosis. It's using that reason to get us to a better place. Religion in ideal type fashion meaning at its best, which never has it ever been at its best. But in Max Weber's idea of, hey, we have to set a standard out there so that we live up to it, knowing that we'll fall short of it. And the religion in its best forms in all religions, and I mean everything, polytheism, paganism, humanism, all of it enables a person to live actually and meaningfully. It allows a person and enables them to live actually and meaningfully. And so that's the difference between religion and superstition, which disables a person, believes that God is attacking without warning or ability to defend oneself, and one is constantly in fear. And so being in that fear, they often rely on a sense of salvation eventually, or they don't better their life. Religion is trying to often teach you how to better your life. Now, I need to make a caveat here. Because we have different political views and ideas of what a better life is, we'll often say that something is superstitious when actually it is a way of organizing life that may work for that person. And what I bring up for that in particular is I have many friends who wear the hijab, and people will say, well, that's superstition, as they, aren't allowed to show their hair in public. And it's like, no, there is meaning to this. I had one friend that said, I don't feel like when I'm going through my studies, people are staring at what I'm wearing, and they're treating me with respect, and I'm respecting myself because I'm not having to show my whole body. That's something that we have to make that distinction. So just because you, for example, might be a person that believes that nobody should have to cover their hair, or has a political position, a way in which you believe life should be lived based on public policy and rights, that is different than labeling it a superstition. So be careful of that stereotype or that ability to what I call demonize sometimes something other than what you believe. Religion involves active improvement, whereas superstition involves fears of what would happen if you didn't believe. So you're afraid of the consequences. So you fear that higher power, which typically has, once again, that omnipotent, that over and above striking power, is something that a person is really struggling with. Whereas a person who has a religion usually has practices, doctrines, things that they can even argue and not fully agree with, and they're improving themselves either by adhering to the religion or being what Marx would call a revolutionary change agent and saying, hey, I think this should be improved. I personally feel I'm an LGBTQ advocate and an ally. I have a lot of times where I've in the church been very outspoken in the United Methodist system about inclusivity and full ordination of people who are part of the LGBTQ community, meaning that they really are part of the whole community. There shouldn't be this distinct separation. And so to me, that is something in my doctrine of my church right now that is not there. However, I'm not kicked out, and I'm often working for that improvement, in my opinion, even though others may have different views on that. That's all in the realm of religion. We're all being able to argue about a doctrine. Superstition, on the other hand, often is not about a doctrine. It is about a fear. It is about a demonized experience that is often something that shows up in religion or in the name of religion. So let's keep that going. For example, the witch trials. They were a superstitious act performed in the name of a religion. People do intersect the two constantly. So typically this was a Puritan community when we think about the Salem witch trials, even though in Europe, when we saw the earliest witch trials, it was capitalist development that was often the adherence of that, of the individual, and religious upheaval of leaving the Catholic Church, but also being very fearful of their own salvation because suddenly they don't have somebody to absolve them. They're, having to interpret the Bible themselves. The same is true in Salem. People that are authorities, that were priests, were on the side of the young women who were believers, and they felt that the evil powers of the witches and warlocks, they were demon possessed, and they were cursing people. This is all superstition, that fearfulness. And so in the name of that religion, because if you look at the doctrine of many of those religions, even the Puritan religions, it took a lot of interpretation to get where they got with witch and warlock stuff. Usually it was about sexuality. They were too, in that time, over-sexualized or, overtly independent women and men. And so that was up and against the culture and the religion. And so people took it to a next superstitious act, which was to believe that God would strike them down if they did not strike down and kill these people, and many people were killed. As merchant capitalism grows, religious status starts to play a part in every Western life. This is another thing we start to see, is that as communities develop, they become part of civilization. We see people adhere to these different religions in a way that gives them a certain status in life. Status in worldwide religion has often involved wealth and prestige. Not all people are considered prestigious because of their wealth and religion. I think of Mother Teresa, the Dalai Lama. I think of many of our monks in Buddhism. I think of several people who have been missionaries and lived in poverty. So status can involve not being wealthy, but we see a sense of that blessing and prestige start to develop with merchant capitalism. And an individual can become socially mobile because they're religious. So, for example, a lot of times we still see this in religious sociology today. One of the biggest things we watch for immigrant communities is how they attach themselves possibly to a religious community, because religious communities often can be part of the social service agencies that welcome and advocate for the immigrant. And so they may not have been following the religion of the community that is helping, or that they see as the larger influence in the community. But we often see people go ahead and change their religious affiliation because of that sense of social mobility. This happens everywhere. There's a lot of people that when they move worldwide, they will often change their religion if they cannot find a community. and they may make a blended version of that. The same is true with non-religious people. They may adhere to a different philosophy and try to find the overriding philosophy in a community. The status change could also apply to women, especially when we have a capitalist spirit going on. This is another thing going back to the witch trials. There were times where, of course, if a woman was making her life without a man in early colonialism, that did not fit the patriarchal system. And again, those old barbaric, dualistic ideas of man being good, woman being bad, evil, is associated with Eve and all of that type of ideology. And it places these women in pagan tradition, which is prior to the male god. And so it's still upholding this really ancient dualism that began around 5000 BCE, but sticking this group of women into the conquered history of paganism and actually nomadic life, because they often lived on their own and would move. So this is important for us to recognize in sociology, that those ties over time are important to pay attention to. So the women accused of being a witch were often self-sufficient in a patriarchal system that emphasized reliance on a man. And that, in my opinion, is no coincidence. The possible status change of women and people of non-white origins in the West, because the white Euro world was still based on those barbaric principles, and we started to see whiteness start to come into play, and especially with colonialism and creating commodities out of people and making that distinction between colors of skin and origin of their life, and paganism as opposed to Christian, Western, Islamic, major world religions. But mostly to the non-white European, we start to see this rise of white supremacy. And people think that, that is just about Nazism, and they don't go far back enough to understand that, no, this has been a build since colonialism and in the name of religion. In the United Methodist tradition, we had a huge massacre based in Colorado of a Native American tribe in Colorado, and it was a pastor that ordered it. We did a service of repentance, but does a service of repentance take over the fact that we took millions of lives in the name of being white and being Christian? No. That's where we have to really watch that, is where is that coming from? And is it something that we can look beyond just the Western scope, but to recognize that the enemy among us has been something that kind of was created with that barbarian culture, but we also started to see how that got attached to being white versus being other than white. There's also a shift to localized empathy that starts to happen, whereas people start to see themselves segregated into communities, especially in the early development of America, as people migrated in large droves. We'd never seen a mass migration as big in such a short period of time. So we saw large portions of Europeans. Of course, we had more people who were being brought to the United States that were from Africa, but not counted only as 2/3 individuals, so that it could allow the slavers to have more votes and control over the North. And that's not trying to make a statement. That's actually what it was for. And if you go back and look at the documents, that was what it was uplifting, to say that they could count bodies so that they felt that they could have equal voice. And so we see a localized empathy where people start to develop their own ideas about superstitions, and their religion is created out of, understanding who they we're close to and their kin. And it's not necessarily about family units, but family units are part of it, because remember, they're a now working unit. And as those families start to segregate and connect to themselves, they start to care for each other. So charity begins at home. And if something happens to that one person that family knows, like neighbors, we really see great sense of empathy in the name of religion. But we also have that counterbalance of what's going on with the sense of supremacy. And so you have to recognize that. So we start to see that great other present itself, especially in our Western history of America, as it continues to carry on some of that barbaric tradition of conquering and assimilating. And instead of religion, sometimes necessarily, even though it was used in the name of religion, there's a lot of times superstition is at play. People feel like they will be, or at least they use this in their brain, that they will be punished by God if they do not do this in the name of God. We start to see the rise of exorcism then too, because people suddenly believe in these ideas that you can be demon possessed. It allows people to avoid responsibility when you talk about demon possession. It's like, it's not me, it was something else. This was often if people were struggling with mental illness, had some sort of physical ailments, had some sort of disease that wasn't explained at the time, they would blame it on a demon. And we saw some of that in the history of religion, because that's often what people would, say, some sort of spiritual demon. And it's interesting how, we still use that language today, but we have identified sometimes many of the diseases that people blamed on that demon or that internal takeover by an evil spirit. And yet what we start to see is that religion itself, as it becomes more mainline and up to current day, isn't necessarily believing in that exorcism of demons. It's starting to recognize people bettering themselves through some of the things we have learned in science. Not all religions are there, but many of them take in a new doctrine that says it's not about demons and exorcism, trying to get that demon out of your system. It's about you working on your psyche, or your responsibility to maybe look into medication, even though there's stigma still attached to that as well. So as superstition gets used in the name of religion, we see more tendencies toward people saying they're going to blame that on a demon, or Satan made me do it. As we see religion start to develop in mainline traditions, for example, or along the side of science, which for a long period of time, it has not been opposed. In fact, most of our history, science as it has risen up, has been right there with religion. And most of your top religious leaders are high readers in science, except when we come to evangelical, and we'll talk a little bit about that, even though they can sometimes too. But anyway, recognize that dichotomy, that difference. If people go toward superstition and connect it to religion, you tend to see this great other. People are advocating religion and recognizing self-responsibility and going into the issues and the problems and the conflicts that they have. That typically is something we see in most of our world religions, has ability to do that and encourages it. And the place that gets encouraged most is a congregation. That is not a Christian word, by the way. Congregation just means a group of people in an institutionalized set of values, beliefs, practices that becomes a comfort. And so instead of being superstitious and, acting out of things that can eventually present some sort of racism or some sort of superiority based on, I have a God that is going to punish me if I don't do this, congregations typically will be places where people are called to connect with values and beliefs and practices that become a comfort, and also check and balance, once again, what's going on with people individually, because they're also geared toward improvement. And they may challenge the person to face the reality rather than demons. Although there are religions that will adhere to that demonic piece. Now, I'm going to share something with you. They typically are part of a system where there are individual churches or congregations that don't have a larger religious connection to a denomination, or some sort of a group for that check and balance. So when you see demon possession, for example, I've gone to the mountains of Tennessee and seen exorcisms in small little community churches that are just everywhere, and the preacher is completely in white and, calling out the devil. That little church has no connection with the larger system, no larger religious system. And so that's typically where we see that, is the more individualized or apart from a largest religious tradition, the more that tends to happen. Changes to a person through religion may depend on how much one believes modernity and its role in explaining the world. So this is the other thing, is a lot of times we see superstitions carried on for long periods of time, and people who are superstitious sometimes are suspicious of science and using gnosis, that is knowledge that continues to expand, instead chooses to use old explanations for the world. And there's a lot of times that person or the group will not change much. Is modernity good? That's not what we're trying to say. Modernity brings many problems. As we've seen, industrialization, globalization, and all kinds of things challenge us. It does, however, cause us to be in the presence of the great other on a weekly basis, daily basis, and not hide ourselves off into some isolated experience. So there's times where we have to recognize the power of religion to constantly keep us in the presence of modernity, even though it may feel slow if you're religious. Additionally, it may depend on how much modernity is believed to hold society together. We're going through a time of great social unrest. I don't see that as a coincidence, and I don't see it as an end of the world thing personally. We're just going through another major change where the world is living digitally connected, and there is an entire expression of how we connect with others that you couldn't prepare for, nor could we prepare for in times before, where we discovered the world was round, or actually egg-shaped, and that we discovered the printing press, and people were able to raise their literacy level. And people often at those times will start to talk demon possession. We'll see a heightened level of suspicion and that type of thing. So that's something you have to recognize when people say, modernity can't be trusted. Things that are going on, progress isn't always good. We're just a bunch of people that have gone too far. Is that superstitious, or is that religious? And are we afraid of the new glue? What's going to glue us together? Because it hasn't always been the same glue that has kept people together. This is why religion must adapt or change, and we see that. Religion adapts and changes. Superstition tries to remain the same. If religion doesn't reflect societal adaptation based on modern discovery and change, then it runs the risk of becoming irrelevant and losing power as an institution. But it also loses a self of it being a social organized construct that constantly reflects the beliefs, values, and doctrines of the people that adhere it. And so we do see a lot of that, and we see a lot of adapting and changing going on right now. So that is scary for people, because once again, that uncertainty comes to the forefront. Rather than seeing new religions develop, this is another thing I think from the text Lexkow does a really good job with. Instead of calling something new, oh, it's a new religious movement, it's something totally new. It's different, and it may have new aspects, but really most religions adapt and become an alternative religious movement rather than NRM, ARM from now on. You may choose to disagree with that, but if you really look again at the ancient stories that we're standing on, typically we're doing something alternative to a religious movement that we know, or in relationship or adaptation. And we're taking some of the key stories that we know, whether it be from the religious tradition or science or blending, whatever the case, it's alternative. And so that's what I'd prefer. But once again, if you believe that NRM is the right way to go with it, that's fine. But I think that alternative religious movement has a better validation of what's really going on. Table 4.1 talks about the differences, by the way, between cult, which you'll study a little bit with some of the videos this week, and we'll talk more about it in future lectures, alternative religion, and emergent religion. Now, I do believe emergent, it's shaping often from the alternative, but that's something I keep in mind, is that these three are really well done with good old sociological terms, empirical manifestations of adaptation over time. Along with adaptation, religious life may have certain ethnic flavors based on location and interaction with groups different than their own. Like we've said, things adapt over time. We saw, for example, in the early Civil War period, Christianity is something that the slave communities would often take upon and had no choice sometimes to become converted to. So we saw sometimes a blending of the traditional native culture of Africa, and those were different because they came from different areas of a large continent. And we also had, slaves that weren't necessarily just from Africa. So we saw different levels of what we call ethnic background, and the situation of being in those fields and being oppressed created a certain flavor for what we call the African American tradition of Christianity. And so when we look at, for example, a Sunday morning, we still tend to see people in Christian tradition go toward ethnic similarity. And it's often because of that history and that story that they're built on. But it's adapted with that group. And we're actually seeing a growth in adaptation toward multiculturalism. It's slow, but it's happening. But once again, it's adaptation over time as we, as a whole entire world, start to interact a little bit more and diversify. Another good example is Detroit, huge Muslim population, largest one in the United States of America, even though we only have like 4.4% Muslims in the United States or something like that. The largest population of them is in Detroit. Outside of Detroit, you can see large mosques everywhere. Christians there, though, large ethnic diversity in Detroit. Downtown Detroit, the actual city, is 98% Black or of some sort of, it's non-white. Let's just say that. It is 99% non-white. And so we see these different groups who may have different religions, but they have also a kind of an ethnic flair of being non-white. So that's another thing you have to pay attention to, is how do people feel comfortable with each other with different types of variables at play, and how's religion adapting around that? Adaptation is often gradual, not abrupt. It's expected in functionalism, which is something going back to Durkheim, to have all things have kind of a purpose and a glue, and we adapt over time. It is expected in progress, but it needs to settle into a new norm. In functionalism, it's expecting a new normal that is the status quo. Conflict theory and Marxism would say that religion never settles. It's always changing. The norms are never the same. Unequal power is always there despite the changes and adaptations. And so that's two ways of really looking with the theory again at how superstition and religion are kind of defined based on that sense of adaptation. Alternative religion also may become more common in the mainline religion. This is something we're seeing, and people are not necessarily believing, but we're in a major adaptation time right now. So what we call our alternative religion might mean that some of our major denominations that have had power may break into new traditions. We're seeing that happen in large scope. Doesn't mean religion is going away. This is happening with the Islamic world. There's a huge feminist movement going right now in Islam. Buddhism has many capitalist connections. We see businesses taking on Buddhist principles and making that work for better production. These are all alternative religions. So that may be where we're going. And it's not necessarily, people think mainline religion means it's been here forever. No, it was an adaptation, just like this is. So as beliefs differ, practices conform to society, we see it reflexively. That's a term we use in sociology. Reflexively, both are bouncing each other back and forth. And as society has done some major changes in our technological jumps and our connectivity, we're starting to see that change in our religious aspects as well. Every major religion has normative values that yet interpretation of them in society and reflection of a belief about God or gods with supernatural will shift these normative values over time. So as society changes its norms, religions will. Either that or they die. But they don't really die, they adapt. They just change into something else. So vice versa, if religion is changing, which it is, we see a lot more women in the United Methodist Church in the state of Kansas, Nebraska. There are equal amounts of women serving churches as there are men. And so that's huge compared to 100 years ago. So it affects the norms and values of society. We start to see, as more people are exposed to females in the pulpit, that there's a lot more change in how people believe about women and equality and those types of things. The other thing we have to recognize with superstition and religion is that slavery, that owning and exploitation of another person, is often held up in the name of a religion. And people will say, oh, that went away, that's done, we've got equal rights. That's not true. We're still in the midst of the adaptation of slavery, of what it did in this nation, how it was religiously upheld. We still experience it with child exploitation and sex trade, and slavery is maybe at the highest height as far as total numbers constantly being exploited and traded than we've maybe ever seen, because we can't keep track of the numbers, but it's done in very different underground worlds. But we have to recognize society sometimes wants to say that we've moved past it. Modernity has come and slavery's gone away. But we have to look at society. Are people really being treated equally? Are we still creating demonized others? Have we changed reflexively on the practice of treating people as less than? Or do we recognize that we have racism issues, white superiority issues, misogynist issues, and what's going on and how hasn't it changed? So I challenge you at the end of this lecture to really take that to heart. What is it that has happened, and what hasn't? Basically based on something as big as slavery and how it affects people. Because this leads to us looking at a couple things, which next week we'll go into a little bit more. Fundamentalism, where people create those sacred texts and doctrines and rigidly interpret it. And that has been often a result of the after Reconstruction. We started to see fundamentalism rise. We saw it rise as a form of this is what God is wanting, and creating a community. Sometimes, with many ethnic adherents, people with big histories around the world that in the United States are intersecting with each other. In fact, fundamentalism was highly jumped by an African-American who was from Oklahoma, who heard a speaker from Topeka and went to California at Sousa Street and created a community that believed in speaking in tongues and the breaking down of all walls of ethnic division. However, the sacred texts then were taken very rigidly with that group, and men and women were separated into different groups and types. So we start to see that adaptation isn't always about modernity. It can sometimes retreat people into these more tight groups that are looking for more certainty. And then we also see the issue of dominionism, which is legitimizing that bias of the others, the fall of the other, as God's will, and or God and God's will, God's will, validating it because it's a plan that's found in the texts. And we'll talk more about that next week. Studying the lack of adaption in religions helps us to understand how adherents operate in society. However, one person may be more devout as an adherent than another. And are they practicing religion, superstition, or dominionism? Are people trying to say this is God's will, practicing a religion where there's social continuity and usually some sort of an adaptive principle going on? Or is it superstition, something that has just been carried on as a fear that if they don't practice it, they'll be punished? I hope that you enjoyed that. I know it's long. Keep going. Keep those posts going. Once again, here's my contact information. Let me know if there's anything I can help with.